Chapter 21. So briefly, what happens in this chapter is that Renfield admits to the gentleman that he has in fact let Dracula into the asylum. Dracula is obviously caught forcing Mina to drink his blood. Mina explains Dracula's plan to use her to punish those who have fought against him, and Renfield dies. So let's have a look here. The text starts with Seward's diary, which is the 3rd of October. So this chapter starts with Seward taking over the storytelling, reminding us that obviously his character carries the main burden of the narrative. And I think it's interesting, and we haven't looked at this before, but if we take a look at his name, which is Seward, it's very similar to Macbeth's commander Seward, S-I-W-A-R-D. And this raises a question, perhaps. Is this Dr. Seward, is he expected to be some form of warrior? Because if we're very honest with ourselves, he's not very much the warrior type. He's not overtly physical and overtly strong. And rather, he seems to be an intellectual warrior, and he provides a sounding board for Van Helsing's ideas and arguments, and they get to talk to one another and bounce ideas of one another. So perhaps when we look at him, he is in some respect a warrior, but more along the lines of an intellectual one. So we start on the 3rd of October, and Seward says, "Let me put down with exactness all that happened as well as I can remember it. Since last I made an entry, not a detail that I can recall must be forgotten. In all calmness, I must proceed." So we get the impression that what is to follow is going to be somewhat frenetic. He's had to calm down in order to write this, but at the same time, he's had to write it pretty soon after events so that he remembers what happened and then he gets it right. So he goes on to say, "When I came to Renfield's room, I found him lying on the floor on his left side in a glittering pool of blood." So Renfield is found very badly injured and, of course, lying in his own blood. Okay. So it becomes obviously very apparent very quickly that Renfield has been severely injured. Obviously, Van Helsing is fetched, and he once more takes charge. Now again, we're reminded that Van Helsing is quite significantly older than the other gentlemen. Seward, Quincy, and Arthur are probably all around the same age, Jonathan as well, whereas Van Helsing has a few more years on these gentlemen. So it's only, and he has the most experience out of all of them, so it's only natural that he takes charge. And of course Renfield's examined, and both Van Helsing and Seward decide that they need to operate on him. And it's quite interesting because we are reminded through this gruesome operation, because it is quite a quite a bloodthirsty almost operation, and we have to be reminded that Seward and Van Helsing are both doctors and surgeons, as well as philosophers and doctors of psychology. So what they have to do is, as you see, the patient was breathing stertorously, which means noisy, labored breathing. So he's struggling to breathe. Perhaps in his beating, he's received a punctured lung and is therefore struggling. Alternatively, they talk about him having possibly broken his neck. And perhaps that's therefore having an impact on his ability to breathe because of paralysis setting in. But Van Helsing and Seward realized that this is very serious and something needs to be done immediately. And words like celerity, which means great smooth movement, quick movement, speed, implies that they are well aware of how dangerous this is. So again, the whole idea of the depiction of this operation is not only to be gruesome, which it is, to show Seward and Van Helsing and to remind us of their roles of a doctor and a surgeon, but also it seems to show off Stoker's knowledge of medical procedures. And again, remember, he was very up to date at the time, and the fact that they are looking at going to release pressure on the brain by drilling a hole in the cranium is significant. Obviously, what they do allows Renfield to surface and explain what happened. So again, please remember, despite the fact that they are trephining, which means to saw a hole in the head, and despite the fact that this is very gruesome, it is also a story, and of course Stoker has set it up so that of course Renfield does need to last long enough to tell us what happened. Okay, so they go into quite a bit of detail about the operation, and Renfield is able to come around. He tells them that he felt that it was a dream, and he says, I must not deceive myself, it was no dream but all a grim reality. So he does know that it wasn't a dream, but it feels like it was a dream. He says how he was unable to speak earlier, and that he is to blame for Dracula's admittance to the asylum. He is the one who invited him in. Now, again, we are reminded that part of this whole novel is that vampires cannot enter unless they have been invited. Please remember that Mina and Jonathan and Seward and Van Helsing and Quincy and Arthur are all staying in Seward's apartments, which are part of the asylum. They are not separate. So by inviting Dracula in to the asylum, that is how he gains access to the apartments. Okay. So in a low voice, Renfield proceeded. It talks about, he says, he came up to the window in the mist, as I had seen him often before. So again, we're reminded of his ability to shapeshift. We're reminded of his ability to use nature, to use the weather in order to conceal himself. And then it says, but he was solid then, not a ghost, and his eyes were fierce like a man's when angry. So he is a corporeal being. All right. And it goes on to say that he was laughing with his red mouth. The sharp white teeth glinted in the moonlight when he turned to look back over the belt of trees to where the dogs were barking. He says, I wouldn't ask him to come in first, though I knew he wanted to. Okay. So it's this idea that he is a corporeal being, and he is able to have this control, and he is able to move about at will and change structure and change the way he looks. Okay. We're then reminded of how Dracula used to send in the flies to Renfield, and how this is how he controlled him. And again, he's very persuasive, and we do need to bear that in mind, that he's a very persuasive man. And by man, I'm talking about Dracula here, because he, of course, identifies a person's weakness and then preys upon it. So he's able to read people very well. So to persuade Renfield, he does not like he does with Jonathan, he does not appeal to sexuality. Instead, he looks at what does Renfield desire the most. And of course, Renfield wants someone to look up to. He wants someone to be able to almost worship, to be able to emulate. And that's what Dracula becomes for him. So he doesn't use the sexual energy, he doesn't manipulate Renfield through beautiful naked or half semi-clad woman like he does with Jonathan, but instead he offers him the ideal possibility of an unlimited supply of life, because of course Renfield is a zoophagus, and he feels this need to feed on animals, and of course Dracula provides him with this by saying to him, right, well, I will give this to you if you worship me. So he is clearly very astute and able to pick up on individuals and what makes them tick. So he applies his persuasive techniques to the characters by identifying what their weakness is. as we go through the chapter, notice please how Renfield, when he speaks of Dracula, he always capitalizes any pronouns associated with him. So the he lands up having being capitalized, which of course has elevated Dracula to a godlike status. And we are aware that in his own mind he has elevated Dracula to this godlike status. But we, the audience, and the guys who are fighting, we need to realize that he has a weakness and that he is capable of being destroyed. Interestingly, he says how he draws parallels between his temptation by Dracula and Christ's temptation on the mountain. And he says, all these lives will I give you, I, and many more and greater, through countless ages, if you will fall down and worship me. Now, the biblical allusion and parallels here are very, very obvious. And again, a Victorian audience would have picked up on this immediately. Would have been absolutely flabbergasted and shocked with the idea that perhaps Renfield is drawing parallels between him and Christ. I don't think Renfield is saying that as much as Stoker using it to focus the reader's attention on how evil, just how very evil Dracula is by associating him with Satan. So to put it in perspective, after Christ was baptized by John the Baptist, he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights in the Judean desert. And during this time, he was tempted 3 times by Satan. And if you look at the 3 different temptations, they were in the areas of hedonism, in terms of exploring hunger and satisfaction, egoism and materialism. So if you go to Matthew chapter 4 in the Bible, it says, again the devil took him up on an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, all these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. So again, this extract and illusion would have obviously been obvious to a Victorian audience. Okay, Dracula associates himself with Satan, and the implication of devil worship would not have been missed by a Victorian reader, because there was this great fear of devil worship and the idea that it did have such negative repercussions. Again, I'm not belittling the idea of devil worship, each to his own, but just to make you aware that this was something that Victorians would have known about. Okay. And he goes on, Renfield. He didn't even smell the same. So he says he waits all day for Dracula, but he didn't send me anything, not even a blowfly. And when the moon got up, I was pretty angry. Now, of course, it appears that Renfield, with this extract, appears that Renfield has not worked out Dracula cannot function outside of the cover of darkness that he needs. He's unable to work during the day. So, of course, while waiting, unbeknownst to him, he can wait all day, and Dracula's never going to show up. It has to be at night. But he becomes quite angry, and Renfield says that when he does come to visit after being away all day, he didn't even smell the same as he went by me. I couldn't hold him. I thought that somehow Mrs. Harker had come into the room. So Renfield's saying that he believes Dracula went to see Mina, because he talks about how when she visited him the afternoon, her blood had seemed to have run out of her. And in fact, he talks about the pale people, and in this case he refers to Mina as one of the pale people, and he works out that Dracula is in fact taking this blood from her. He is visiting. And it's interesting because Renfield, when it's him personally, he does not ever resist Dracula. It is not until Mina is being negatively affected that he does start to resist. And we are reminded that, of course, when Mina went to visit him in the previous chapter, how polite she was, and she treated him with deference, and she spoke to him as an equal and showed him great respect, and he really, really appreciated that. I think coming from a situation where he's considered mad, and I'm going to put mad in inverted commas there, and therefore probably treated with no respect whatsoever. So she's made such a difference by treating him in this way, and of course therefore he he develops a bond with her, and he doesn't want to see her hurt. So when he realizes that she is one of the pale people, he decides then that he needs to actually stand up for her. Okay, so he says, I like them with lots of blood in them, and hers had all seemed to have run out. So a chilling reminder, obviously, that Renfield's is insane, although he has moments of rationality and sanity. And again, that's a whole different argument and exploration as to what is insanity. But despite this, despite his madness and the idea that he could be that madness could fuel his insanity, he is still no match for Dracula. In fact, he talks about how Dracula has mesmerized him. Now, the word mesmerized actually is quite interesting. It's been adapted. It's an eponym, which means it comes from somebody's name. And it comes from Franz Anton Mesmer, who was an Austrian physician and the father, and recognized as the father of hypnotism. So he was born in 1734, and he died in 1815. In the early 1770s, he began experimenting with what he called animal magnetism, the ability to hypnotize. He referred to as animal magnetism, believing that being swayed by individuals and being overwhelmed by the animal magnetism was a cure for mental illness. So he would induce this trance-like state in his subjects, but again, it was very dependent on their susceptibility. And as we've spoken about before, hypnosis is not something that when you see it on TV, when they're having these shows and they get people up to do all sorts of weird and wonderful things, people will not respond to hypnosis unless they are susceptible. They will also not fall under hypnosis and do things that they wouldn't ordinarily be open to doing. So it's not really so when you see in shows them getting people to do these outrageous things, very likely it's a trick, but also the idea is that the person would behave in that way even if they weren't under hypnosis. Of course, mesmerism is the forerunner for hypnosis, but old Mesmer was discredited because he claimed to be able to treat and remove female sexual inhibition, but he didn't really get that right. So, of course, that kind of made people realize that he might not have been as brilliant as he thought he was, and this discredited him. So, Renfield talks about Dracula's eyes. His eyes, they burned into me and my strength became like water. And this is the idea of the hypnosis. He is susceptible to Dracula. And of course, we've got to remember that he is crushed. He's talking, he is telling us all of this in a state of complete physical discomfort. He's been really wretchedly hurt. He's clearly on death's door, yet he's managed to still carry the narrative for us and be quite positive. Okay, his descriptions are very, very interesting. And what happens is, we've heard this whole story and his voice becoming fainter and his breath more stertorous, and Van Helsing stood up instinctively. So we've got this poor man, we're reminded at this point that he is in fact dying and he is suffering greatly. So of course the narrative now moves away from him, and it's going to move back to Seward saying what happened, and we actually find out about his death, Renfield's death, a little later when Arthur puts in, Arthur tells us about it. So of course Van Helsing and the others have to rush off to save Mina at this point because they realize that something is amiss, and they have to rush off then. And of course the next part of the narrative, which goes from Van Helsing stood up instinctively, because this is when he realizes what's going on, he states, "We know the worst now," he said. "He is here, and we know his purpose. It may not be too late." So Stoker's heroes have to leap into action. They know the worst. They now have to move on. They now need to deal with the situation. So of course they're going to force their entry into the Harker bedroom, and they'll see Dracula forcing Mina to drink his blood while Jonathan is lying on the bed, mesmerized, for want of a better word. Okay, so as soon as they realize we know the worst now, they get up, they storm the Harker's bedroom, they find Dracula in action, and of course, this is the only moment in the novel when, in fact, Dracula is seen clearly by both the narrator and the reader, and we see him in action. Both us and the characters in the text see Dracula in action. Interestingly, though, it's not there. He has not the blood sucking from the neck that we would expect. Instead, so we expect to go in and find Dracula feeding on Mina, but we've got the reversal of roles, and the element of force suggests an element of rape as opposed to seduction, and this is really important. So instead of it being a seductive, sexually heightened experience where he is lavishing attention upon her neck, which is an erogenous zone, instead he is forcing Mina to suck on him. And so again, we have to have the idea of force being emphasized, because remember, Mina has got to be seen as the innocent victim, in contrast to Lucy, who he did suck on her neck, and Lucy seemed to enjoy it. In this case, we need to know, and we need to be reminded that, of course, Mina is not in that way sexually aroused. Okay. So, of course, Seward is the first. He runs in, and he is the first to see Dracula with Mina, and his heart seems to stand still. And we're reminded that he is a man who habitually suppresses his emotions. He seems to, as we've seen, he seems to lack the ability or the vocabulary to comfort other people. He seems to be very inept when it comes to dealing with emotions, which of course are quite ironic considering he is a psychiatrist. So he doesn't know how to deal with people, and remember when he tried to comfort Arthur at Lucy's funeral, and he had to kind of resort to non-verbal communication. I don't know if you recall. It said a grip of the hand, the tightening of an arm over the shoulder, and expressions of sympathy dear to a man's heart. He's not very successful. He's not actually able to seemingly to be able to comfort them. But again, I think it's interesting because when Mina and Jonathan experience this anguish following the interaction, we're going to have a look at this in a minute, with Dracula, he's able to weep with the rest of them. He just seems to be unable to show them comfort. And it says here at the end of the paragraph, beginning with, "He turned the handle as he spoke," and he says, "My heart seemed to stand still. The moonlight was so bright that through the thick yellow blind the room was light enough to see. On the bed beside the window lay Jonathan Harker, his face flushed and breathing heavily as though in a stupor." So again, we are reminded of the whole idea of mesmerism, and the idea that Jonathan has been mesmerized by Dracula, and Dracula has taken control of him. And kneeling on the edge, near the edge of the bed, facing outwards, was the white-clad figure of his wife. So again, notice the concept of her being innocent, dressed in white, this virginal figure. By her side stood a tall, thin man, clad in black. Okay, so of course the description of Dracula here is definitive. Stoker has, because of the popularity of his text, is inadvertently provided us a costume description, which seems to have stuck. And most Dracula movies, or most vampire movies, they seem to be wearing black. So he's got this waxen face and he's got these sharp white teeth, and you know, he's really portrayed as this figure of death and danger. It goes on a bit later to talk about how his parted red lips, which obviously are an invitation to the feast, and almost a repulsive indication of just how eager he is. He's panting for this. He needs Mina's blood. He needs her. And he champs. His teeth are champing. He's champing at the bit. He's like a wild beast. Okay. And it goes on to say that with his left hand, he held both Mrs. Harker's hands, keeping them away with her arms at full tension. His right hand gripped her by the back of the neck, forcing her face down on his bosom. So he's restraining Mina. He's forcing her to do his bidding. And then goes on to say the attitude of the two had a terrible resemblance to a child forcing a kitten's nose into a source of milk to compel it to drink. So this violence of this man forcing this woman to suck his blood, and yet the description of the scene with a child forcing a kitten's nose into a source of milk seems very restrained, and in fact that almost inappropriate. And we are reminded again that Seward is our narrator, and this description makes us sit back and think, really? And perhaps Stoker's done this just to emphasize how awful the scene is, that there is no way you can compare it to anything, but similarly demonstrating to us that Seward is completely unable, he is unable to comprehend what he's seeing, and therefore is almost unable to put voice to what has happened here. Okay. And again, we're reminded that Dracula possesses people in order to control others. He has no interest in Mina herself, other than looking at her as a source for food, but more importantly, a way to infiltrate the group. Okay, because again, let me remind you that he represents a foreign threat to the Western or British way of life. This man, Count Dracula, his name by the very definition, is a nobleman and a gentleman who's supposed to be fulfill particular behaviors, but of course he isn't a traditional English gentleman. Instead, he's a debased and cruel aristocrat. And we kind of see the superficial and deceitful charm in contrast with Lord Godalming, because remember, Lord Godalming is representing the British nobility. And I think maybe Stoker's suggesting that Dracula's exhausted his position in Transylvania, and if he wants, obviously, his vampire, or needs his vampire dynasty to grow, he has had to come and invade territories like England. Okay, and therefore the question I want to ask you is, and I know I've gone a little bit off track here, sorry, but is Dracula trying to grow his dynasty, or is he trying to protect himself? Because is he the last? Does he have to leave Transylvania because the inhabitants know who he is? Because, of course, he's been there for so long. Again, just something for you to think about. But I think it's important that we look at Dracula's appearance at this stage of the novel as quite interesting, because in the first phase of the novel, we see him in Castle Dracula, where we see hints of his menace and his nastiness through his manipulation of Jonathan. When he informs Jonathan and the reader of his desire for power, he says none other should be master, and then of course he disappears from the novel, and we don't physically see him again. We in great detail. We see only glimpses through evidence given by the various narrators. Obviously he never, as we've seen, he's never seems to disappear entirely, but if you think back, and even if you look at what we've just seen now, he tends more to be discussed than described. So this chapter is quite interesting, because we are now getting the description more than the discussion. And it's in this chapter he appears, he forces Mina to drink his blood. And again, when he escapes, ambush in chapter 23, we are actually seeing him, the character. We are not hearing secondhand through somebody else. So when he appears directly, he demonstrates terrible cruelty. So when we get as the reader to see him in action, and the fact that he seems to enjoy playing with his enemies, reminds us again of how much he seemed to enjoy tormenting Jonathan right at the beginning of the novel in the first 3 chapters. Why does he do this? Well, I think he sees himself as historically important. He believes he is someone, and in fact described himself as a person who commanded nations and intrigued for them and fought for them hundreds of years before you were born. And he is this, and he enjoys this power, and he enjoys being able to manipulate and hurt people. Anyway, when they all come in the room, the Count suddenly stopped and cowered back, and further back he cowered as we lifting our crucifix we advanced. So he escapes, and Mina is left with a thin open wound on her neck, which she feels leaves her unclean. So we've got this man whose eyes flamed red. He is compared to a beast, an animal, which of course, remember, has no control. And this is the being that we get to see. And of course, Harker, we then see what tells us that Harker is very upset by what has happened because he's been unable to save his wife, because he's been hypnotized by Dracula, and he's been able to do nothing about it. So he yells, "Guard her while I look for him." And he is about to go out and chase down Dracula, and Mina has to restrain her husband. She has to stop him rushing out. Okay, because she realizes he might do something that he might regret, or because he's not thinking logically and he's out of control, something awful might happen. So again, we are reminded that of a Victorian gentleman, and again the gender roles and the specified gender roles here, where Harker should be protecting and saving his wife, but in the end it's twisted when Mina has to stop him from going out, and in turn protects him from losing his life. So she has this thin open wound, and she now describes herself as unclean. Okay, and again we have another biblical allusion, because brings to mind the biblical stories of lepers. Leprosy is a skin disease, and they would have to announce wherever they went that they were unclean, so people wouldn't get too close and contract leprosy. So Jonathan, we now see kind of cast in the role of this righteous Christian who has to protect and help and kind of comfort his wife, who feels he is unclean. Okay, so we've got, and we're reminded again that he is initially described as this quiet, businesslike gentleman, which we saw in chapter 17. So yet when his wife is threatened, he becomes filled with this righteous anger. And in this tale, of course, he's the male character whose masculine integrity is most directly challenged. All right. None of the other characters seem to recognize the sexuality aroused by all the temptations offered. In fact, the most erotic episode in the text, of course, is experienced, narrated, felt by Jonathan. And of course, as a result, he is left with this consuming guilt, these self-recriminations. He is really feeling very, very guilty. And now he's been unable to protect his wife from attack. Okay. Obviously, we need to remember that, of course, he did reject the awful woman. and that as we go through, there's these constant parallels drawn between Mina and the very sexually not explicit, but very, very sexual female vampires. Remember, of course, he described in chapter 4, Harker describes the two extremes in femininity when he says, "For Mina is a woman, and there is naught in common. They are devils of the pit." And of course, I think this man has got so much he feels he needs to make amends for. I mean, when he left Transylvania, the experience in Transylvania left him very weak and nervous, and up until very recently in the text, he's come across as doubting himself, and doubting his position as a man. And in fact, he said, "If only I knew it was the doubt as to the reality of the whole thing that knocked me over, I felt impotent and in the dark and distrustful," which he said, if you recall, in chapter 14. And of course, we, the reader, I think, have been left viewing Jonathan as weak. And it's not until now, this moment when he becomes so angry, when he shows his righteous indignation, that we begin to suspect that, okay, this could be a man that is a force to be reckoned with, because I think we've underestimated him up until this point. And I think the fact that his boss gave him everything, his boss, when he died, endowed all his wealth, all his worldly goods to Jonathan, should have already given us an indication of what a good man he was and how he was worthy of respect. But we, of course, didn't see Jonathan in those lights. We only saw Jonathan going to Transylvania, and then within the first chapter is the only time we see him being himself, and then from then on he is under lock and key and under extreme pressure. And I think that we underestimate him, and we forget that he is this great man. And this is when Seward shows faith in Jonathan here at this point. We are again reminded that he is an important man. He is a man whose mouth was set with steel. He has studied calmness, nervous power, white passion. All right, he is very strong. I think also, though, we do need to remind ourselves that Van Helsing goes a long way to help Jonathan kind of restore his self-confidence and help him become this new man. Again, looking at him in terms, Jonathan, in terms of this righteous Christian soldier marching into war, as I feel I'm singing the hymn there. This idea of regeneration, this turning of a new leaf, becoming a new man, rising up out of the ashes, is a very crucial point in the Christian faith. Christians obviously believe that they are reborn in Christ. So, Jonathan is this man. He is this righteous Christian. And it's when Jonathan, I think, is reassured that what he wrote in his diary is true, when Mina and the others take it on board and don't doubt him. It's at that point where he begins to turn and become this righteous warrior. So I think he comes into his own in this third phase of the novel, and this is when we see the Jonathan that we have not yet had a chance to visit with or to experience. Okay. Just trying to find here. And sorry, I'm going to have to re-go through these slides here, but he talks about talking about having a little refreshment first. Let's have a look at this. So we've got Dracula. They discover once they've rescued Mina, they walk off and they discover that Dracula's been in the study. amazingly. He's destroyed all the copies of the accumulated paperwork, so there is no examples of the phonographs, etc., except the one which is in the safe. We also at this point discover that Renfield, bless him, has died. And Arthur is the one who tells us. And remember, Renfield's main raison d'etre, or reason for being, is he is an indicator. He is there to indicate to us when he's the early indicator of Dracula's presence, both in and around Carfax and the asylum. So he's the one who endangers Mina by allowing the Count into the asylum. And it's here towards the end that we see him here turn against Dracula. And perhaps he is selfish. Perhaps he's done it because he doesn't want to, he suddenly realizes he's going to be suffering for eternity. Because again, Victorians had a strong, deeply rooted faith in the idea of the afterlife. So he realizes he's going to hell and he's going to be suffering for eternity. But maybe his conversation with Mina inspires him to want to protect her, because Mina's the poster girl for virtue and goodness. So of course it's not unheard of or surprising that she would have convinced Renfield to be want to be a better man. Perhaps he had to die in this horribly awful way as a punishment for his treachery. Maybe that's why Dracula beats him up so badly. I mean, as we know, Dracula is not a big fan of people who turn against him. So I think with Renfield's death, we need to step back and remind ourselves that perhaps he represents a model of human arrogance in the pursuit of knowledge. He seems to think he can be immortal, and hence why he colludes with Dracula. But maybe he needs to realize this is not possible. I mean, I think one needs to be reminded of what the Greek dramatist Euripides pointed out, that those who God wishes to destroy, he first makes mad. And I think that's quite an interesting point in his attempt to gain a godlike status and immortality. Of course, Renfield does become mad. So I think overall, though, he's not a very well developed character. He's really rather flat. He doesn't seem to have very many levels of activity. I suppose if we look at it, we could put him into 3 levels. He's lucid, number one. He's lucid and sounds reasonably sane. The second state, I think, is when he's a little bit odd and he's starting to suffer from mania. And then, of course, the final stage is when he's bonkers, and he's suffering from frenetic mania. And I think he's therefore not developed because he's not the focus. He doesn't have a big part to play, other than, like I said, to be an early indicator of Dracula's presence. I mean, Seward's initial interest in Renfield is, as he says, is because he's, quote unquote, so unlike the normal lunatic. And I think if when you go back and read through this again, you find that Seward seems to admire Renfield. I mean, at least Renfield has a sense of purpose. He feels that he has a reason for being. Interestingly, though, I mean, Renfield tells Seward that he is, quote, as sane as at least the majority of men who are in full possession of their liberties, close quote. And I think that, again, is a very interesting comment, and something that one should explore in terms of to what extent are we sane or insane. So we're not really sure why, of course, Dracula chooses to forge this connection with the Zoophagus. Maybe it's because they have something in common in that they both need to consume life in order to prolong their own. Just remember that Dracula seems to need their souls or want, and creates undead, whereas Renfield has no interest in that whatsoever. I mean, look, we're never given a reason. We're not explained fully why Renfield refers to Dracula as master, and we can only assume that it's because he holds him in high esteem, because obviously Dracula seems to have all of these abilities. He is able to appear and disappear in the mist. He's able to kind of take on the role of a wolf and tame the wolves, etc. As we and let's just go back to the idea. So now Renfield's died, and we go back to Mina and we see what is happening, and she describes being attacked by Dracula, and she tells the group that of course Dracula now is going to use her to destroy anyone who gets in his way. So here we've got this: I took a sleeping draft which you had so kindly given me, but for a long time it did not act. So Mina is given the chance to describe what happened from her point of view. Please bear in mind that Seward is still writing this. So Stoker has used the technique of obviously embedded or multi-layered narrative, because it's Seward's diary, but Mina's given the voice and she's allowed to retell the story or tell her story. So her narrative obviously is framed within Seward's narrative perspective. And Stoker then even goes one step further, because he of course has Mina voice Dracula's perspective. So it's quite convoluted, and we do need to step back and give it some thought. And I think it's the only time in the novel when Dracula addresses the reader. He doesn't anywhere else. And of course he's vengeful and he's cruelly mocking of their attempt to stop him, and he does, and when he speaks, he's given this almost melodramatic villain kind of monologue. And we are reminded obviously that melodrama was a term originally used to describe stage presentation featuring songs of orchestral accompaniment. So it's the idea that you get the impression of this noise and this drum roll as he walks in, and of course during the Victorian era melodrama was very, very popular because it allowed for reader participation. So when we get this idea of Dracula telling us his story, silence, if you make a sound I shall take him and dash his brains out before my very eyes, etc., etc., it's this kind of very melodramatic and of course his comment, first a little refreshment to reward my exertions, of course is purely theatrical and really rather entertaining. Okay. He describes himself, we go on, he describes himself, talks about his firstly, just before this line, sorry, he says he commanded nations and intrigued for them and fought for them. So he is well aware of his worth, and he goes on to say, and you, their best beloved one, are now to me flesh of my flesh, blood of my blood, kin of my kin, my bountiful winepress. And it's at this stage I need to say to you, note there's a lot of alliteration. We've got flesh of flesh, blood of blood, kin of kin, bountiful, harsh, discordant sounds. And again, just give a really chilling effect. But notice, again, Dracula's linguistic choices. He talks about being a winepress and flesh of flesh and blood of blood, which is archaic. And again, we are reminded that he's had to learn English from books. I mean, he describes Mina as a bountiful winepress. It's not something that is done in this day and age, or even so much perhaps in Victorian era. So we are reminded that she is forced to drink his blood, and the very act of drinking Dracula's blood straight from his body and being forced to suffocate or swallow clearly mimics the sex act. And she says, what have I done? Mina says, what have I done to deserve such a fate? And I think this is the only chapter in this chapter is the only time in the novel where Dracula is shown to be openly participating in bloodletting. Okay, his own blood is spilt, and it because he is not taking blood and he is spilling his own. Perhaps this is the link that leads to his downfall. But it's Mina's forced submission to Dracula's will that obviously creates or develops or allows for the establishment of this telepathic link, which Dracula has forged in his attempt to see what the group are up to, but actually unwittingly allowing the team to have an invaluable tool to fight against him, because yes, Mina is forced to obey Dracula, but in the end she doesn't succumb, and in the end she turns the tables on him and uses his invasion of her mind and her thoughts to see what he's up to. Obviously, Mina questions her fate. What have I done to deserve this? And it's quite interesting because she's not one for self-pity, and we at this, we've never seen her being full of self-pity. So this is clearly the lowest point she falls to within the novel, and we understand that she has fallen quite low. Okay. But we move from Mina's state of guilty desperation now, and then as she's telling her terrible story, the eastern sky began to quicken and everything became more and more clear, and Harker was still and quiet. So we move to Jonathan, who's obviously still in the state of shock. What he's experienced has turned his hair white. Okay. This is interesting because it's an ancient myth that your hair will turn white overnight in response to terrible shock. Yes, hair can turn white, but it tends to take 2 to 3 weeks to do so. But of course, Stoker kind of needs this for dramatic effect. Plus, it's a reliance on superstition. So the whole thing combines. And so Jonathan turns completely white overnight. And he's portrayed here as this miserable figure. And maybe Stoker is trying to comment, and it has been argued that, of course, Stoker could be trying to comment that this is what happens if you leave your wife at the power of such evil temptation. Because, of course, ladies, we need to remember that we need men to give us the strength and the support. Okay, again, please remember, this is a Victorian novel, and gender roles were very specific. So we cannot criticize Stoker for what he is saying here or the implication. We can only study it within the context of the novel. So we're back at so in the end of the chapter, of course, Seward is resuming the narrative, and he says here, we have arranged that one of us stay within call of the unhappy pair. And his tone is now very somber, and the syntax is quite dreary. So his final bit there, where he talks about the sun rises today on no more miserable house in all the great round of its daily course. He's almost showing here, he's pretty much saying that, everyone always says things will be better in the light of day, but maybe in this case they're not going to be, because of course things are not better. They couldn't seem to be much worse. We are reminded with Dracula's final words and his departing, when he says, he talks about, he says, he spoke mockingly, and so you, like others, would pay your brains against mine. You would help these men to hunt me and frustrate me in my designs. Me, who commanded nations and intrigued for them and fought for them, and you, the best that shall be later, you shall be avenged. Okay, you have aided in thwarting me. And of course, we need to remember that Dracula doesn't seem to have much capacity for love. I mean, he hints in chapter 3 when he tells the 3 vampire women, he says, yes, I too can love, with the implication being that love is a choice and he chooses not to love. But I think it's also important, we've just seen here with Mina, he exudes sexual power, but it's not, again, associated with love. Please note, it's more to do with dominance and ruthlessness and his ability to be in control and command. So Stoker also kind of draws on the idea of the bad boy, because of course his arrogance, in this is Dracula here, seems to add to his erotic appeal. He's this alpha male, and he's the selfish, egotistical parasite, and he's a man, but he's also an animal. And again, this is the kind of male that many women tend to want to fix. And it's just interesting that's why, to some, perhaps, Dracula can still be seen as very, very attractive.